I'm Eric, 32 male. I'm a graphic designer, or at least I was until a year ago. I live, or rather used to live, in the sprawling suburban house my father built, the same house I grew up in. For the past 12 months, my life wasn't about color palettes and client deadlines. It was about medication schedules, physical therapy, and the quiet, draining work of being a full-time caregiver. I thought I was doing it out of love and obligation, a son's duty to his ailing father. But I was about to find out it was all based on a cruel and calculated lie that would leave me with nothing but the clothes on my back. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. The scent of antiseptic and stale coffee is one you never forget. It clings to your clothes, your hair, your memory. For 3 weeks, that was my world. I spent most of my waking hours in a cramped, beige-colored room at St. Jude's Hospital, watching my father, Henry, sleep. He was 72, a retired architect who had always seemed as solid and permanent as the buildings he designed. But a sudden, massive stroke had turned him into a fragile man tangled in tubes and wires, his powerful voice reduced to a faint whisper. My stepmother, Alina, was always there, of course. She'd sit by his bedside, holding his hand, dabbing his brow with a cool cloth, the very picture of a devoted wife. She had been married to my father for nearly 15 years, ever since my own mother passed away. Alina was an art gallery curator, a woman who moved through the world with an air of sophisticated grace. Everything about her was curated: her clothes, her friendships, her emotions. She was always perfectly composed, even now. She would sigh softly, her eyes welling with perfectly formed tears, and tell the nurses how she just didn't know what she would do without him. I was working as a freelance graphic designer at the time, building a solid client base and finally feeling like I had some momentum. My small apartment downtown was my sanctuary, a space I'd curated for myself, filled with art books and sketches. But when my dad had the stroke, all of that came to a screeching halt. I put my projects on hold, telling my clients I had a family emergency, and dedicated my time to the hospital visits. Sam, my best friend since kindergarten, would bring me food and fresh clothes, telling me to take a break, but I couldn't. I felt a deep primal need to be there for my dad. It was in the third week, when the doctors started talking about long-term care, that Alina pulled me aside into the sterile quiet of the hospital corridor. Her face was a mask of weary anguish. "Eric," she began, her voice trembling just enough to be convincing. "The doctors say he's stable enough to come home soon. But he's going to need constant care, around the clock." I nodded, my stomach twisting. I knew what this meant. Nursing homes were incredibly expensive, and my father's insurance wouldn't cover the kind of facility Alina would deem acceptable. "I don't know how we'll manage," she continued, looking down at her perfectly manicured hands. "I have the gallery, the upcoming exhibit. I can't just abandon my responsibilities. And hiring a full-time nurse, the cost is astronomical. It would drain every last cent of your father's savings." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle in the air between us. Then she looked up, her eyes locking onto mine. This was the moment, the pitch. "You and your father have always been so close," she said, her voice dropping to an intimate whisper. "He loves you more than anything. Having you there at home, taking care of him, it would be the best medicine in the world. It would mean everything to him." The guilt was a physical thing, a heavy cloak she draped over my shoulders. She was framing it as a choice between my career and my father's well-being. "I can't do it all myself, Eric. I need your help. We need your help." I thought about my clients, the deadlines, the apartment I loved, but then I thought about my dad lying in that bed helpless. He had spent his life providing for me, teaching me, supporting me. How could I turn my back on him now? "Of course I'll help, Alina," I said, the words coming out before I had a chance to fully process their implications. "Whatever he needs." A brilliant, relieved smile broke through her practiced sadness. It was like the sun coming out from behind a cloud. "Oh, Eric, thank you. I knew I could count on you." She hugged me tightly, her expensive perfume filling my senses. "This is just a temporary arrangement, of course," she added, quickly pulling back. "Just until he's back on his feet. The house is big enough for all of us. You can move back into your old room. We'll be a family taking care of our own. Don't you worry about a thing, we'll take care of you." That was the promise. "We'll take care of you." It sounded so sincere, so reassuring. I gave up my apartment, packed my life into a dozen boxes, and put my career on an indefinite hold. I moved back into the house my father built, the house my mother had filled with warmth before she was gone. I told myself it was the right thing to do. It was for my dad. I had no idea I was just a pawn in Alina's long game, a temporary solution to a problem she had no intention of dealing with herself. The promise she made in that hospital hallway was as sterile and empty as the corridor itself. The first few months were a blur of grueling routine. My days were dictated by the beep of a pill dispenser and the rhythmic hum of a hospital bed installed in the downstairs living room. Mornings started at 6 a.m. with medication, a sponge bath, and the slow, arduous process of getting my father into his wheelchair. I learned to cook pureed foods, to administer injections, to perform the physical therapy exercises the visiting nurse taught me. I was a son, a cook, a nurse, and a physical therapist all rolled into one. My graphic design skills lay dormant, my laptop gathering dust in my old bedroom. Alina was present. She would float into the living room in the mornings, dressed for her day at the gallery, place a gentle kiss on Henry's forehead, and tell me what a saint I was. "I don't know how I'd do this without you, Eric," she'd say with a grateful smile before grabbing her designer handbag and heading out the door. She was home for dinner, but she was often too exhausted from her emotionally draining day to help with the evening routine. She'd recount stories of difficult artists or demanding patrons, framing her work as a burden she bore for the family's sake. The gallery, she claimed, was essential to keeping their finances afloat during this difficult time. I was the one lifting my father, cleaning him, staying up with him when he was agitated in the middle of the night. But in her narrative, we were a team. Slowly, miraculously, my dad began to improve. The flicker of recognition in his eyes grew stronger. His speech, at first just garbled sounds, began to form into slurred words. The physical therapist was amazed at his progress, crediting the constant, dedicated at-home care. "You're doing a great job, son," my dad mumbled one afternoon, his hand weakly gripping my arm. It was the first coherent sentence he'd spoken in months. I felt a surge of pride and love that washed away all the exhaustion. It was all worth it. After a year, Henry had stabilized. He could now feed himself, hold a conversation, and even stand with the help of a walker for a few moments. He wasn't the man he used to be, but he was present, he was aware, and he was out of immediate danger. The round-the-clock intensive care phase was over. He still needed assistance, but it was manageable. I started thinking about my own life again. Maybe I could start taking on a small project or two. Maybe I could start looking for a new apartment. I was sitting at the kitchen table one Tuesday morning, sketching in my old notepad for the first time in a year when Alina came in. She was looking at a glossy real estate magazine. "Isn't this a lovely property?" she said, pointing to a sleek modern condo downtown. "So much more manageable than this big old house. Less to clean, you know." I felt a knot of unease in my stomach. "The house is fine, Alina. Dad loves it here." "Oh, I know," she said dismissively, "but we have to be practical. Your father's long-term care will be expensive. We need to downsize, liquefy assets." The clinical, detached way she said liquefy assets sent a chill down my spine. She was talking about my home, my father's home, the place he built with his own two hands. 2 weeks later, I came home from a grocery run to find it. A bright red and white for sale sign hammered into the front lawn. My blood ran cold. I stormed into the house, my heart pounding. Alina was on the phone, her voice light and cheerful. She held up a finger, asking me to wait. I didn't wait. "What is that?" I demanded, pointing out the window. She ended her call with a sigh of annoyance. "Eric, we discussed this. It's time to be realistic. A lovely couple is coming to view the property this afternoon. You're selling the house just like that without even talking to me or Dad about it. Your father and I have discussed our finances," she said coolly, her warm facade evaporating. "He agrees this is the best course of action. He signed the listing agreement yesterday." I looked toward the living room where my dad was dozing in his chair. It was possible she'd put a paper in front of him and he'd signed it without fully understanding. His cognitive function was better, but he was still vulnerable, still trusting. The final blow came a month later. The house sold astonishingly fast. Alina was ecstatic. I, on the other hand, was in a state of panic. I had no job, my savings were gone, and the place I had called home for a year was about to belong to someone else. I tried to talk to her about my future, about her promise to take care of me. That's when she dropped the bomb. I was sitting on the edge of my bed, surrounded by packed boxes, when she appeared in the doorway, an envelope in her hand. "Here," she said, her tone businesslike. "This should help you get on your feet." Inside was a check for $5,000. $5,000 for a year of my life. "The new owners close in 2 weeks, she informed me. "They want the property vacant. I've found a wonderful assisted living community for your father and a lovely new condo for myself. You'll need to find your own arrangements." Jobless, homeless. I had sacrificed everything based on her tearful plea in that hospital corridor, and now I was being discarded like a used bandage. The eviction notice wasn't a piece of paper taped to the door. It was the cold, final look in her eyes. The deal was done. My service was no longer required. The 2 weeks that followed were a waking nightmare. I felt like a ghost haunting the hallways of my own past. Movers hired by Alina came and methodically packed up the life my father had built. They were efficient and impersonal, wrapping memories in paper and sealing them in cardboard. Alina directed them with the precision of a general, pointing out which furniture was going to her new condo, which was going to a storage unit, and which was to be donated. My belongings, the contents of my single bedroom, were piled in a corner, an insignificant footnote in the grand dismantling of our family home. I managed to get my dad to myself for a few minutes while Alina was busy negotiating with the moving foreman. He was sitting in his wheelchair by the large bay window he had designed, looking out at the garden my mother had so lovingly tended. "Dad, do you understand what's happening?" I asked, my voice low and urgent. "Do you know Alina is selling the house?" He looked at me, his expression clouded with confusion. "Alina said smaller place, easier, less work." He struggled with the words. "She said you were fine with it, that you were going to start your life again." She showed me the check. The $5,000 check. It wasn't a severance package, it was a prop in her play. She had used it to convince my father that I was being taken care of, that I was a willing participant in this whole affair. The betrayal was so layered, so complex, it was hard to know where to even begin unraveling it. The day I had to leave was gray and drizzling, a perfect pathetic fallacy. I had packed my car with my clothes, my laptop, and a few boxes of personal effects. The rest of my things were going into a cheap storage unit Sam had helped me find. Sam had been my rock, offering me his couch without a second's hesitation. "We'll figure this out, man," he said, clapping a hand on my shoulder. "She's a monster, we'll figure it out." I went to say goodbye to my dad. Alina was there, of course, fussing over him. "Now, Henry, the transport to the new facility will be here in an hour," she said brightly. "It's going to be wonderful, they have a pool." She turned to me with a saccharine smile. "All settled, Eric, do you have everything you need?" I ignored her and knelt in front of my father's wheelchair. "I love you, Dad." He grabbed my hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "Love you, son, be good." There were tears in his eyes, and in that moment I knew he was starting to grasp the reality of the situation, the finality of it. It broke my heart. As I was walking out the door for the last time, I stopped at the hall closet. There was an old shoebox on the top shelf filled with my mom's things, random keepsakes she had saved. I couldn't let it be thrown out. I grabbed the box and tossed it in my car without thinking, another piece of my past salvaged from the wreckage. I spent the first few days at Sam's place in a fog, alternating between rage and a deep, hollow despair. I was 32 years old, sleeping on a couch with a few $1,000s to my name and a career that had been on ice for a year. On the third night, unable to sleep, I found myself rummaging through that old shoebox from the closet. It was filled with dusty treasures, old photos, my first grade report card, a dried corsage from a high school dance. And at the very bottom, beneath a bundle of letters, was a thick, yellowed manila envelope. On the front, in my mother's elegant handwriting, it said, "For Eric, just in case." My heart skipped a beat. Inside was a collection of documents. There was a copy of her will, which was straightforward. Everything had been left to my father with the assumption he would provide for me, but tucked behind it was another document, older and more faded. It was a copy of the original deed to the house. I scanned through the dense legal language, not really knowing what I was looking for. Then I saw it, a paragraph circled in red pen by my mother's hand. It was a survivorship clause, but a very specific one she must have had her lawyer draft when they first built the house. It stated that in the event of my father remarrying, if the property were ever to be sold while I, his biological son, was a legal resident therein, I would be entitled to a 50% share of the net proceeds. I read it again and a third time. My hands were shaking. Legal resident. I had given up my apartment. I had moved back in. My driver's license, my bank statements, my car registration all listed this address for the past 12 months. I was a legal resident. My mother, gone for 15 years, had reached through time to protect me. She must have known on some level what my father was like, a good man but easily swayed, perhaps a little naive when it came to people's intentions. She had put this clause in place as a failsafe, a final act of maternal protection, just in case. She couldn't have possibly predicted Alina, but she had anticipated a future where I might be vulnerable. The despair that had been crushing me for days began to recede, replaced by something else, something hot and sharp: hope. It wasn't just hope, it was the promise of justice. Alina thought she had won. She thought she had stripped me of my home, my job, and my dignity, paying me off with a pittance. But she had no idea about the time bomb my mother had hidden in the foundation of the very house she had just sold. The next morning, I wasn't going to be scrolling through job boards or apartment listings. I was going to be calling a lawyer. Finding the right lawyer felt like the most important decision of my life. Sam, ever the pragmatist, immediately went into research mode. "You don't want a general family lawyer," he advised, scrolling through listings on his laptop. "You need a shark, someone who specializes in estate law and property disputes, someone who eats people like Alina for breakfast." His search led us to Ms. Evelyn Reed. Her website was professional, no nonsense, and her bio was formidable. She had over 2 decades of experience in contentious estate litigation. Her tagline was clarity in conflict. I needed clarity, and I definitely had a conflict. I called her office and managed to get a consultation for the following day. I walked into the law firm of Reed and Associates feeling like a child playing dress-up. I had put on my nicest remaining clothes, but I still felt like an imposter in the world of polished mahogany and quiet, expensive efficiency. Ms. Reed, however, put me at ease immediately. She was a woman of about 50 with sharp, intelligent eyes and a calm, reassuring demeanor. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Mr. Collins," she said, gesturing for me to sit. "Your friend gave my assistant a brief overview. Please tell me everything from the beginning. Don't leave out a single detail." For the next hour, I did just that. I told her about my father's stroke, Eleanor's plea, the year of caregiving, the for sale sign, the $5,000 check, and the final, crushing eviction. I recounted conversations verbatim, trying to paint a clear picture of Eleanor's manipulation. When I finished, I pushed the yellow deed across the desk. And then I found this, my mother's handwriting. Ms. Reed put on a pair of reading glasses and examined the document in silence. She read the circled clause several times, her expression unreadable. The silence stretched on, each second ratcheting up my anxiety. Finally, she took off her glasses and looked at me. "Your mother was a very smart woman," she said, a hint of a smile touching her lips. "This clause is highly specific, but it is ironclad. Were you a legal resident at the time of the sale?" "Yes," I said, my voice hoarse. "My driver's license, bank accounts, car registration, everything was registered to that address for the last year." "And can you prove you were acting as your father's primary caregiver?" I think so. There were visiting nurses who saw me there every day, pharmacy records for his prescriptions that I picked up. My friend Sam can attest to it. I have text messages with Eleanor where I'm updating her on his condition while she's at work." Ms. Reed nodded slowly, her mind clearly at work. "Eleanor will likely argue that you were merely a tenant or a guest in the house. She will claim the $5,000 was a gift, a gesture of goodwill. Our job is to prove that you moved in under a specific agreement to provide care and that this residency coupled with this clause entitles you to your share." The word share sounded like music. "So you think I have a case, Mr. Collins," she said, leaning forward. "You don't just have a case, you have a very, very strong one." Her entire plan hinged on the assumption that no one knew this clause existed. She committed a form of promissory estoppel, making a promise that you acted upon to your detriment, and then she appears to have taken advantage of your father's diminished capacity to execute the sale. This isn't just about the money, Eric. It's about fraudulent misrepresentation. The first step, she explained, was to gather evidence. Over the next few weeks, Ms. Reed's office was a whirlwind of activity. She had me compile every text message, every email, every possible piece of correspondence between myself and Eleanor. We subpoenaed the records from the visiting nurse agency, which detailed my role as the primary caregiver. We got sworn affidavits from the physical therapist and even one of the neighbors who had seen me day in and day out helping my father in the garden. Ms. Reed hired a private investigator to do a full financial workup on Eleanor. The findings were sickeningly predictable. Eleanor wasn't struggling financially as she had claimed. The art gallery was doing exceptionally well. She hadn't needed to sell the house for my father's care. In fact, she had recently purchased her new luxury condo with cash, a transaction made just days after she received the wire transfer from the sale of my father's house. She had also moved a significant portion of the remaining proceeds into a private investment account solely in her name. She hadn't earmarked a single dollar for Henry's long-term care. She had placed him in a state-funded facility, one that was adequate but a far cry from the wonderful community with a pool she had described. She had planned this from the moment my father got sick. His illness wasn't a tragedy to her, it was an opportunity. She needed him stable enough to legally sign paperwork, and she needed a cheap caregiver to get him to that point. I was the perfect fool, motivated by love and guilt. The most damning piece of evidence came from the investigator's deep dive into her past. It turned out that Eleanor's first husband had also been a wealthy, older man who had died under ambiguous circumstances, leaving her his entire fortune. There was no proof of foul play, but the pattern was chilling. She was a predator who targeted vulnerable, wealthy men. My father was just her latest victim. Seeing all the evidence laid out on Ms. Reed's conference table, the bank statements, the affidavits, the investigator's report was both horrifying and validating. I wasn't crazy. I hadn't imagined the injustice. It was real, it was calculated, and it was evil. "She never thought you'd fight back," Ms. Reed said, her voice firm. "She sees you as the soft-hearted son she could easily manipulate. She is about to find out how wrong she was." The decision to sue was not one I took lightly. It meant formally declaring war on a member of my own family. It meant putting my father in his fragile state in the middle of a legal battle. Ms. Reed was clear about the process. It would be emotionally taxing and potentially long. "The first step," she explained, "is to send a demand letter. We will lay out our claim, cite the clause in the deed, and demand your 50% share of the proceeds from the sale. We give her a chance to settle this quietly. Given the evidence, a smart lawyer would advise her to take the deal." "And if she doesn't?" I asked. "Then we file a lawsuit and proceed to discovery," Ms. Reed replied without hesitation. "That's when it gets unpleasant. We will depose her. We will depose your father. We will subpoena every financial record she has. We will make her life very, very uncomfortable." My biggest concern was my dad. I didn't want this to cause him more distress. I arranged to visit him at the new facility. It was clean but sterile, lacking any of the warmth of his home. He seemed smaller in the cramped, generic room. "Dad, I need to talk to you about something important," I began, sitting beside him. I explained the situation as gently as I could. I told him about the clause my mom had put in the deed, about Alina selling the house and keeping all the money, and about my decision to hire a lawyer. He listened, his brow furrowed in concentration. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. "Your mother," he finally said, his voice thick with emotion. "She always thought ahead. She knew I was a fool for a pretty face." It was a moment of shocking clarity. He understood. He saw Alina for who she was. "You do it," he said, his hand gripping mine. "You get what's yours, what your mother wanted for you." His blessing was the final piece of resolve I needed. I called Ms. Reed and gave her the green light. The demand letter was drafted and sent via courier to Alina's new luxurious condo. It was a masterpiece of legal precision, outlining her fraudulent misrepresentation, the breach of her promise, and the undeniable legal standing of the deed's clause. It demanded payment of my share, which after the mortgage was paid off amounted to just over $800,000 within 30 days. We didn't have to wait 30 days. Less than a week later, Ms. Reed received a call from Alina's newly hired attorney. His name was Mr. Davenport, and according to Ms. Reed, he was a notoriously aggressive litigator known for bullying opponents into submission. His opening salvo was predictable. "He called your claim frivolous and opportunistic," Ms. Reed relayed to me over the phone. "He said you were an ungrateful son attempting to extort money from your grieving stepmother. He said the $5,000 was a generous gift and that you have no legal standing." "So she's not going to settle?" I asked, my stomach sinking. "On the contrary," Ms. Reed said, and I could hear the satisfaction in her voice. "This level of aggression is a classic sign of a weak position. They're trying to scare us off. They know we have them." Mr. Davenport finished his tirade by offering a nuisance settlement of $50,000 provided you sign a non-disclosure agreement. $50,000. It was a tempting sum for someone sleeping on his friend's couch, but it was an insult. It was an admission of guilt disguised as a dismissal. "No," I said, my voice harder than I expected. "No deal." "Good," Ms. Reed said. "I was hoping you'd say that. I've already prepared the court filing. We're officially suing her." The transition from caregiver to litigant was surreal. For a year, my biggest battles had been coaxing my dad to eat or fighting with an insurance company over a medical bill. Now my days were spent in strategy sessions with Ms. Reed, reviewing documents and preparing for the fight of my life. The lawsuit was filed and the game was on. Sam was my constant cheerleader. "Think of it like one of your design projects," he told me one night as I was poring over legal documents. "You're building a case. Every piece of evidence is a design element. You're creating a final product that is so clear and compelling, no one can argue with it." He was right. I started to see it that way. Alina had tried to erase me from the picture, to crop me out of the family portrait. This lawsuit was my way of redesigning the entire canvas, of putting myself back where I belonged, not just as a son but as an equal partner my mother had always intended me to be. The stethoscope, so to speak, was put away. I was no longer just a caregiver. I was a plaintiff, and I was ready to fight. The discovery phase of a lawsuit is designed to be a war of attrition. It's a relentless exchange of paperwork, requests for documents, and interrogatories, all intended to wear down the other side until they break. Alina's lawyer, Mr. Davenport, was a master of this tactic. He buried us in mountains of pointless requests, demanding everything from my elementary school report cards to my complete social media history, all in an attempt to find something, anything, he could use to paint me as an unstable, greedy person. But Ms. Reed was unflappable. For every ridiculous request he sent, she sent back a sharper, more targeted one, demanding Alina's complete financial records, communication logs, and details of her previous marriage. We were building our case brick by brick, and the foundation was solid. The centerpiece of the discovery process was the deposition. This was our chance to question Alina under oath, to lock her into a story she couldn't change later in court. Ms. Reed spent days preparing me for my own deposition, but she spent even more time preparing to question Alina. "This is where we win the case," she told me. "People like Alina are used to controlling the narrative. Under oath with no room to spin, they often crumble." The deposition took place in a sterile conference room at a neutral law firm. Alina walked in looking like she was attending a gallery opening. She wore a tailored, cream-colored suit, her hair perfectly styled, her expression one of bored condescension. She barely glanced at me. Mr. Davenport sat beside her, whispering reassurances. For the first hour, he constantly objected, trying to disrupt Ms. Reed's rhythm. But Ms. Reed was a master. She remained calm, rephrasing her questions with surgical precision, slowly and methodically boxing Alina in. She started with the basics: Alina's relationship with my father, her career, her finances. Alina answered with practiced ease, painting herself as a loving wife forced into difficult decisions by a tragic illness. Then Ms. Reed shifted to the year I spent as a caregiver. Mrs. Collins, during the 12 months that Eric lived in your home, what were his primary responsibilities? He was there to help out, Alina said vaguely. To keep his father company. Is it your testimony that his role was simply companionship? Ms. Reed pressed. Did he not administer medication, assist with physical therapy, handle all the cooking and cleaning related to his father's care? I may have asked him to help with small things from time to time, Alina conceded, her polished veneer showing. The first tiny crack. Ms. Reed then produced the sworn affidavit from the visiting nurse, the one that described my role as essential, round-the-clock primary care. She read a passage aloud. Eric Collins was solely responsible for the patient's daily care regimen. Without his intervention, the patient's recovery would have been significantly impaired. Do you dispute the professional assessment of your husband's own nurse, Mrs. Collins? Alina shifted in her seat. I'm not a medical professional. I did the best I could. The turning point came when Ms. Reed brought up the house. You claim you sold the house to cover the costs of Henry's future care, is that correct? Yes, of course, Alina said a little too quickly. It was a painful but necessary decision. Ms. Reed slid a bank statement across the table. It was the statement from Alina's private investment account showing a deposit of over $1 million, the proceeds from the sale, just 2 days after closing. She then slid another document next to it. It was the invoice from the state-funded facility where my father was living. This statement shows you transferred the entire net proceeds of the sale into a personal investment fund solely in your name. And this invoice shows that my client's father is currently in a facility that costs a fraction of what you claimed he would need. In fact, his care is largely being subsidized by the state. Can you explain that discrepancy, Mrs. Collins? The color drained from Alina's face. She looked at Mr. Davenport, but he had no objection to make. The documents spoke for themselves. I was advised to invest the money to make it grow for the future, she stammered, and the facility is temporary until a spot opens up at the nicer place. Is that so? Ms. Reed continued, her voice like ice. Because we have a signed statement from the director of that nicer place who says you were offered a room for your husband 3 weeks ago and you turned it down, citing the cost. The same week you purchased a brand new luxury car. The final devastating blow was the deed itself. Ms. Reed placed a copy in front of Alina. Mrs. Collins, are you familiar with this document? It's the deed to the house. Please read the highlighted paragraph aloud for the record. Alina's eyes scanned the text. I watched as the meaning of the words sank in. Her carefully constructed composure shattered. Her face, for the first time, showed raw, unfiltered panic. She looked at her lawyer, who could only offer a helpless shrug. He'd clearly been made aware of the clause, but seeing it as part of this avalanche of evidence was different. I've never seen that before, she lied, her voice a thin whisper. It must be some kind of forgery. A forgery? Ms. Reed raised an eyebrow. Mrs. Collins, this document was recorded with the county clerk's office 25 years ago. We have the certified original. Are you suggesting my client's deceased mother conspired with the county to forge a legal document in anticipation of you one day selling the house from under her son? Is that your testimony under oath? Alina was silent. The facade had not just cracked, it had been utterly demolished. She was exposed under the harsh fluorescent lights of that conference room, not as a grieving wife but as a cold, calculating predator. The deposition ended shortly after. As they were packing their briefcases, Mr. Davenport approached Ms. Reed. His aggressive demeanor was gone, replaced by the weary resignation of a man who knew he was beaten. Let's talk, he said quietly. The settlement negotiation was swift. Mr. Davenport, stripped of his bluster, knew they had no leverage. Alina's testimony was a disaster, riddled with lies that were easily disproven by our mountain of evidence. Going to court would be a public humiliation for her, and a jury would likely be even less sympathetic than we were. Ms. Reed was in a position of absolute strength, and she did not squander it. She rejected their first offer, the original 50% share, outright. That's no longer sufficient, she told Mr. Davenport over the phone while I sat in her office. Your client proceeded with this fraudulent sale, forced my client into homelessness, and caused significant emotional and financial distress. She will pay his 50% share, she will cover all of his legal fees, and she will add an additional sum for damages. After a brief token resistance, they agreed. The final settlement was staggering. I was to receive my full share of the house proceeds, plus an additional 6-figure sum for damages and legal costs. The money would be wired to an account Ms. Reed helped me set up within 7 business days. When she told me the final number, I couldn't speak. It was more money than I had ever imagined seeing in my life. It wasn't just a victory, it was a vindication of my mother's foresight, my father's love, and my own sacrifice. The day the wire transfer hit my account, I just stared at the number on my banking app for a full 10 minutes. It didn't feel real. Sam, who was looking over my shoulder, just started laughing. You did it, man, you actually did it. My first act wasn't to buy a fancy car or a new wardrobe, it was to take care of my dad. With the help of a geriatric care manager, I found the best private long-term care facility in the state. It was a beautiful place, set on sprawling green grounds with skilled nurses, daily activities, and a warm, compassionate staff. I used a portion of the settlement to pay for his care for the next decade up front, ensuring that he would never have to worry, no matter what Aliner did or didn't do. Moving him, there was one of the best days of my life. He had a private room with a window overlooking a garden, and I filled it with his favorite books and photos of my mom. The look of peace on his face was worth more than any amount of money. "Thank you, son," he said, his voice clear and strong. "You saved me." "No, Dad," I replied. "Mom saved both of us." With my father settled and secure, I could finally start rebuilding my own life. I rented a beautiful loft apartment in the city's arts district, a space with high ceilings and huge windows that flooded the rooms with natural light. I set up a state-of-the-art home office and started reaching out to my old clients. My portfolio was a year out of date, but my story was a powerful one. People were drawn to the narrative of resilience, and work started pouring in. I was no longer just a freelance designer, I was the owner of my own small, thriving creative agency. I never saw or spoke to Alina again. I heard through the grapevine that she became something of a social pariah after the details of the lawsuit inevitably leaked. The art world is small and gossipy, and her reputation as a sophisticated benefactor was replaced by that of a greedy elder abuser. She sold her gallery and moved out of state, a quiet, ignominious retreat. The house, my father's house, my childhood home, was something I thought about often. Driving by it one day, I saw the new family, a young couple with a small child playing on the lawn. For a moment, I felt a pang of sadness, but it was quickly replaced by a sense of peace. A house is just a structure of wood and nails. A home is built from love, security, and integrity, things Alina could never understand. I had lost the structure, but I had reclaimed what truly mattered. My new apartment, the one I had chosen and paid for with the justice I had fought for, felt more like home than that house ever had in that final dark year. I had the keys to my own door, the keys to my own business, and the keys to my own future. My mother's last wish wasn't just about money, it was about ensuring I had the foundation to build my own life on my own terms. And that's exactly what I was doing.